guys, for those of you that watched last week's Betwixt the Books episode, which if you haven't, you totally should, but for those of you who did, I mentioned a book that I read this year that I loved enough to look into when the sequel was going to come out, and that was Sufficiently Advanced Magic by Andrew Rowe. When I mentioned it in that video, I couldn't remember who had talked about it on BookTube for it to catch my eye, and I believe it was Kitty G. I saw her video on it, and I'll link that down below for sure so that you guys can watch her talk about it. I wanted to give her credit for that because a lot of the times somebody will say something and I'll make a note of it, and then I completely forget who it was on BookTube that told me about it, and I feel like I should be spreading around the love a little bit, even though everybody that I watch has way more subscribers than we do. This is one of those weird instances where I saw the book, mentioned to my partner that I had wanted it, and he mentioned that I hadn't bought books in a while, so it would be okay if I actually bought this one. We're not the most financially stable, and I have plenty of reading material. But I had wanted to read it, got it in the mail, started reading it, and had it read within a week of hearing about it, which doesn't often happen for me, maybe because I buy too many books, but it's also just that seeing something and finding it interesting and having that be the exact time when I have the mental capacity to read that type of book doesn't happen very often. But I blazed through this one. It felt very different reading this particular fantasy book than to reading a lot of high fantasy books. I have been reading more fantasy as of late than I had in the past, but for something to captivate me so completely and suck me in like this, you know, there has to be something there in the writing of the book that was able to capture me. I think one of the biggest proponents for this book is the fact that it's based on video games, because it helps move the plot along. Even though this book is 600 pages, it isn't 600 pages that are dull. There wasn't really any moment where I felt like I was bored with it. There were moments where I felt like the way that he structured this text with all of the characters in college, or magic college, allowed him to info dump at us more than a traditional book would have, because he has this structure set out where a professor can be giving this lecture about the world to the character, and that is also lecturing us, the reader, which is not necessarily interesting storytelling and can get a little bit grating, but at the same time, it's not like the narrator is doing it, so it was still acceptable. I did have a handful of small issues with the writing, which may have been worked out if this book had been traditionally published, as if they had an editor who was able to help define and redirect certain things. The biggest problem being that most of the characters to me had the same identifying character trait of, I'm sassy and like to get into weird sass battles with everybody around me, no matter what their rank or power level is. While the sassy protagonist is a common trope in fantasy, at least in most of the fantasy that I have read, when the protagonist is sassy, when the professors are sassy, when the side characters and friends are also sassy, they start to feel a little flat. That isn't to say I didn't enjoy some of the great back and forths that happened because of that sass. It just felt like there was too much of it and not enough character differentiation, so that when he's talking to one female professor versus another female professor, I had to stop and go, wait, is this the professor that's teaching him about runes, or is this the professor that he's working with on the sort of mystery element of the book? Because they sound very similar. I wanted to talk about the way that the magic worked in this world, and is based in, I believe it's older JRPGs, although it might just be regular RPGs as well, or Western RPGs, not regular RPGs. JRPGs are also RPGs. In the tower climbing aspect, where you go in, you complete a floor of a dungeon, fight a boss, go up a level, do the same thing, do the same thing, do the same thing. The idea of how people get magic in this world has to do with that sort of dungeon-based climbing. And that premise, despite being very prevalent in early RPGs, is not very prevalent in fantasy, as far as I can tell. When magic is involved, they generally just have it. Some folks go to school to study and become better at it, but oftentimes it's just some sort of innate quality that people have in the world. Again, I haven't read a lot of fantasy, so I can't say whether or not it's extremely unique, but because these characters have to go through these towers and earn their magic, essentially, the way that they go through the tower, or perhaps where they exit the tower, sort of gives them like a rune that's marked into their body somewhere, and that rune is imbued with a very particular type of magic. So there's people who get summoning magic, and there's people who get protecting magic, and there's people who get elemental magic, but our protagonist got sort of a weird, not weaker magic, but not a fighting magic, in that he is able to create magical items. His family earned their place in the society through fighting, so obviously his father is not very pleased with this, but it seems to suit him as a character. He is much more analytical and much more tool savvy, so it makes sense that he would get this attunement. I don't think that he ever actually thinks about that and talks about that. The other thing I had a little bit of an issue with was that the main overarching plot here, which I think is going to cross several books, is more of a mystery, where the main plot of this book is focusing on getting him his magic and him learning and training in it, with bits and pieces of the mystery sort of interrupting that process. When I was really intrigued with the overarching mystery, there were long stretches of time where I wasn't hearing about it and learning new things, and part of that was because it seemed like the world was actively trying to prevent the protagonist from doing that. And while that's perhaps necessary, he did need to get his magic and learn how to use it. I felt like it could have been spaced a little bit better, the like more interesting looking into those bits. I do want to say the protagonist having a non-heteronormative relationship, no matter how fleeting, was interesting. I enjoyed that fact. I also enjoyed the fact that his main protector friend, so the person who has the like shield magic, who's able to like make their bodies super dense with magic and like punch people really good, was a girl, which I also found very interesting. And I also enjoyed the fact that most of his mentors were female professors. There were male professors, but the ones who were being the most helpful to him were women. And I find that extremely interesting, especially when he is a male character and he's looking up to these female role models. So having a book that has such a focus on women having an equal place in the society was very interesting, and I enjoyed that, and it didn't feel contrived or forced. So if you're looking for a fantasy book that's quickly paced, which is often hard to find, or if you're looking for one with an interesting magic system, which is always fun for me. I always like seeing how the magic is set in the world and how people go about using it. And if you're looking for one that has more of a feel of like video games and how the like structure of a video game would be versus the structure of a traditional fantasy book, this is definitely a good one, plus a lot of really great inclusion and representation. I really enjoyed this one, and if you guys go out and pick it up, let me know what you think about it. Have you heard of it before? Because it is self-published, it doesn't have a marketing team behind it. I hadn't until she held it up for me, and I think Bibliomancy for Beginners might do a round of indie pub / self-published books coming up at some point in the future, because they do get less press because of that, and that's not necessarily for any fault of the book. It just is the case when the person who's pushing it is the person who wrote it and there isn't a team and a bunch of money behind it. That's all I have for you guys today. Gretchen and I will be back on Wednesday to talk about some romance recommendations, because Wednesday is Valentine's Day. And again, as a reminder, we are reading The Hate U Give this month for book club, which is very apt because it's African American History Month, and that's a pretty big title in African American text in YA. So if you haven't read it, now's a great time to pick it up. I know that they're making a movie out of it, so if you're one of those people who wants to read the book before the movie, here's another reason why you should read it. As always, if you would like to see the books that we will be reading in the future, I will link the Goodreads page and this Twitter down below, where we will be talking about all of that stuff, including future books. And you can join in on the discussion there if you don't want to wait for the live stream. I'll talk to you guys again soon. Bye!